I thought I knew everything about my Aunt Helena. She raised me from the time I was 12, told me stories about our family history every Sunday over her famous blueberry pancakes, and promised me that honesty was the foundation of everything good in this world. But sometimes the people we trust most are the ones hiding the biggest secrets. And sometimes those secrets don't just change what you thought you knew about them, they change everything you thought you knew about yourself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Martinez, and 3 weeks ago, I was sorting through my aunt's belongings in her small Victorian house in Salem, Oregon, when I discovered photographs that shattered every story she'd ever told me about who I was and where I came from. What I found in those dusty albums didn't just prove she'd been lying to me for 15 years. It revealed a truth so stunning that I'm still trying to piece together what it means for the rest of my life. The morning it all began, I was sitting cross-legged on Helena's hardwood floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes that smelled like lavender and old paper. The funeral had been the week before, a small service attended by her book club friends, and a few neighbors who remembered her kindness. I'd taken 2 weeks off from my job as a graphic designer in Portland to handle her estate, though honestly, I wasn't ready to go back to my normal life anyway. Helena wasn't just my aunt, she was the only family I had left, or at least the only family I thought I had. The house felt impossibly quiet without her humming in the kitchen or calling out observations about the birds at her feeder. Every room held memories of the woman who'd taken me in when my parents died in a car accident, who'd helped me with homework at this very dining table, who'd taught me to drive in the driveway where her old Buick still sat covered in October leaves. I'd been putting off going through her personal things, focusing instead on the practical stuff: bills, insurance paperwork, the endless bureaucracy of death. But that morning, something made me finally open the closet in her bedroom. That's where I found them. 7 photo albums stacked neatly on the top shelf, their covers faded from years of handling. I'd seen Helena look through photo albums before, usually alone in the evenings when she thought I was asleep or busy with schoolwork. Whenever I'd ask to see them, she'd smile and say they were just old pictures that would bore me, nothing important. Now, pulling them down from the shelf, I realized how heavy they were, how carefully organized each one seemed to be. I carried the first album to the living room and settled into Helena's favorite armchair, the one by the window where late afternoon light filtered through her lace curtains. The cover was deep burgundy leather, worn soft at the edges. When I opened it, the first page made me smile. There was Helena as a young woman, maybe 25, standing in front of a small house with white shutters. She looked radiant, her dark hair curled in the style of the 1980s, wearing a yellow sundress I'd never seen before. The photo was labeled in her careful handwriting: First Day in Salem, 1987. I flipped through more pages, watching Helena's life unfold in carefully preserved moments. Pictures of her learning to garden, hosting dinner parties, volunteering at the local animal shelter. But as I continued looking, something started to feel off. All the photos seemed to begin in 1987. There were no childhood pictures of Helena, no photos of her with my grandparents, no images from the family farm in Iowa that she'd always talked about. It was as if her life had simply materialized in Salem when she was 25, with no past behind her. I opened the second album, hoping to find earlier pictures, but instead I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. The photos were still of Helena, but she looked different somehow. Her hair was shorter, darker. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She was wearing clothes that seemed more formal, more professional, and in every single picture she was with people I'd never seen before. A tall man with kind eyes who had his arm around her in what looked like family photos. An elderly couple who bore no resemblance to the grandparents Helena had described to me. Children of various ages who seemed comfortable with her, who looked at her with the easy familiarity of family. But it was the locations that really confused me. These weren't taken in Salem, Oregon, anywhere in Oregon that I recognized. The backgrounds showed different architecture, different landscapes. One photo showed Helena standing in front of a sign that read, "Welcome to Bakersfield, California." Another showed her at what looked like a high school graduation, arm in arm with a teenage girl who could have been her daughter. My hands started to shake as I turned the pages. In every photo, Helena looked happy, settled, like she belonged exactly where she was. But according to everything she'd ever told me, she'd never lived in California. She'd never mentioned having a daughter, or a husband, or any of these people who filled photograph after photograph with genuine smiles and easy embraces. I set the second album aside and reached for the third, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in the quiet house. This album was different. The photos were more recent, some of them clearly taken in the early 2000s. And there, in the very first picture, was a family portrait that made me drop the album entirely. Helena was in the center of the photo, but she wasn't alone. Beside her stood the same tall man I'd seen in the earlier pictures, now with gray at his temples, but still wearing that same kind expression. Next to him was a teenage girl, with Helena's dark eyes and stubborn chin. And holding Helena's hand was a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with a gap-toothed grin and messy brown hair. The photo was labeled in Helena's handwriting. Christmas 2003. Robert, Helen, Emma, and Michael. Helen. Not Helena. And she was someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's life that I knew absolutely nothing about. I picked up the album with trembling hands and continued looking. Page after page showed this family, Helen's family, living what looked like a completely normal, happy life in what the photo captions revealed was Bakersfield, California. Birthday parties, school events, family vacations, pictures of Helena teaching the little boy to ride a bike, helping the teenage girl get ready for what looked like prom, sitting around a dinner table with people who clearly loved her. The last photo in the album was dated December 15, 2007. It showed Helen, loading suitcases into a car while the tall man watched from the front porch. Unlike all the other photos, this one felt different. Sad. Final. Helena wasn't smiling, and neither was the man. The children weren't in the picture at all. I sat back in the chair, my mind racing. December 2007 was exactly when Helena had moved to Salem, and according to her stories, decided to start fresh after years of caring for our sick grandmother in Iowa. She'd told me she was tired of the isolation, tired of the memories, ready to begin again somewhere new. I'd believed her completely, grateful that her fresh start had eventually led to her taking me in when my parents died 5 years later. But this photo told a completely different story. This photo suggested that Helena had left a family, left a life, left people who needed her. I opened the fourth album with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The photos in this one were heartbreaking. They showed the aftermath of Helena's departure. Pictures of the little boy, Michael, at school events with just his father. Photos of the teenage girl, Emma, at graduation with an empty seat beside the tall man. Christmas mornings that looked subdued, incomplete. But there were also photos that someone else had taken and somehow sent to Helena. Pictures of Emma's wedding in 2015, where she wore a beautiful white dress but kept looking toward the church doors as if waiting for someone who never came. Photos of Michael's high school graduation, where he stood proud and tall next to his father, but something in his eyes looked lost. The most devastating photo was near the end of the album. It showed Michael, now grown into a young man, holding a baby. The caption read, "Michael's son Thomas, born March 2019. He has her eyes." Helena had become a grandmother and had never met her grandchild. I closed the album and just sat there in the growing darkness of her living room, trying to process what I'd discovered. The woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me about integrity and honesty, who'd been my entire world for 15 years, had been living under a false name. She'd abandoned her real family to create a new identity in Salem, and somehow, 5 years into that new life, she'd taken me in when my parents died. Why had she left them? Why had she chosen me over the children she'd raised from birth? And how had she managed to keep this enormous secret for so long? I thought about all the times I'd asked Helena about our family, all the stories she'd told me about growing up on a farm in Iowa with parents who'd died before I could meet them. She'd created an entire fictional family history, complete with details about grandparents who'd supposedly taught her to bake, and uncles who'd served in World War II. Every Sunday morning story had been a lie, carefully constructed to give me a sense of belonging to something larger than just the two of us. But as I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the evidence of Helena's deception, I realized something else. The woman in these photos, Helen, looked happy with her original family, yes, but she also looked different from the Helena I'd known. In the earlier photos, she seemed younger, more carefree, but also somehow less settled in herself. The Helena who'd raised me had possessed a depth, a thoughtfulness, a gentle wisdom that hadn't been as evident in the pictures of her former life. Maybe leaving her family had changed her in ways that made her better equipped to love me. Maybe the guilt of abandoning her first children had taught her something about commitment that made her hold on to me when it would have been easier to let social services find me a different home. Or maybe I was just trying to rationalize the actions of a woman who'd built her entire relationship with me on a foundation of lies. I opened the 5th album, not sure I could handle whatever else I might find. The photos in this one were different again. They seemed to be candid shots, taken from a distance, as if someone had been watching Helena's life in Salem without her knowledge. Pictures of her gardening in her backyard, shopping at the local grocery store, volunteering at the animal shelter. Photos of her attending my school events, helping me move into my first apartment, celebrating my college graduation. Someone had been documenting Helena's new life, but who? And why? The answer came in the final album. The first photo showed a young man standing outside Helena's house, looking toward the windows with an expression of longing and uncertainty. It was Michael, Helena's son, now in his 20s. The photo was recent, maybe taken within the last year or two. The next photos told a story that broke my heart all over again. Michael had found Helena. Somehow, after years of searching, he'd tracked her down to Salem. The photos showed him visiting repeatedly, always stopping at the edge of her property but never approaching the house. One picture captured him sitting in his car across the street, just watching her tend to her garden. Another showed him at the coffee shop downtown, obviously hoping to catch a glimpse of her during her daily routine. But Helena never seemed to notice him. Or if she did, she never acknowledged his presence. The last photo in the collection was dated just 6 weeks before Helena's death. It showed Michael standing at her front door, his hand raised as if to knock, his face a mixture of determination and fear. But Helena's car wasn't in the driveway. He'd missed her. I set down the final album and looked around Helena's living room, seeing it with completely different eyes. Every piece of furniture, every photograph on the mantel, every carefully chosen decoration represented a life she'd built on abandoning her first family. But it also represented the life where she'd loved me, where she'd given me stability and security and a sense of being wanted. I thought about Michael, Helena's biological son, who'd spent years searching for a mother who'd chosen to disappear rather than face whatever had driven her away from her original life. I thought about Emma, who'd walked down the aisle looking for a mother who never came. I thought about the tall man, Robert, who'd raised 2 children alone after the woman he'd loved vanished without explanation. And I thought about the baby in the final photo, Thomas, who would grow up never knowing his grandmother because Helena had died before Michael found the courage to knock on her door. As I sat there surrounded by the fragments of Helena's secret life, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my identity was wrong. I wasn't the only family Helena had left. I was the family she'd chosen over the one she'd abandoned. For 15 years, I'd been living a life built on the ruins of someone else's family, and I'd never even known it. The worst part was that I still loved her. Despite the lies, despite the deception, despite the knowledge that my entire childhood had been constructed around her elaborate fiction, I still missed her terribly. The woman who'd made me blueberry pancakes every Sunday morning, who'd taught me to drive, who'd held me when I cried over my first heartbreak, that woman had been real, even if everything she'd told me about our family had been false. But now I had a choice to make. I could pack up these albums, sell Helena's house, and return to Portland to pretend I'd never discovered her secret. I could honor her memory by protecting the lie she'd worked so hard to maintain. Or I could try to find the family she'd left behind. The brother and sister I'd never known I had, the father who might still be wondering what happened to the woman he'd loved. I looked at the photo of Michael standing at Helena's front door, his hand raised to knock on a door that would never open for him. I thought about Emma, walking down the aisle alone. I thought about little Thomas, who would never know that his grandmother had spent the last 15 years of her life loving a different child. And I realized that some truths are too important to keep buried, even when revealing them means destroying the only family story you've ever known. I picked up my phone and stared at it for a long time before finally opening a search browser. I typed in Robert Helen Emma Michael Bakersfield, California, and held my breath. The first result was an obituary from 2018. Robert Martinez had died of a heart attack at age 62, survived by his children Emma Rodriguez and Michael Martinez, and his grandson Thomas Martinez. The obituary mentioned that he'd spent his final years hoping to reconnect with his beloved wife Helen, who disappeared in 2007 and was presumed dead. Helena had killed off her old identities so completely that her husband had died, believing she was gone forever. But Emma and Michael were still alive, still searching, still hoping for answers about why their mother had vanished without a word, leaving behind a life that had seemed, from the outside, to be everything anyone could want. I sat in Helena's living room as night fell completely, holding my phone and staring at the contact information I'd found for Emma Rodriguez in Bakersfield. I could call her. I could tell her that her mother had been alive until 3 weeks ago, that she'd died peacefully in her sleep, in a house filled with books and plants and memories of a different life entirely. I could tell her about the woman Helena had become, about her quiet generosity and gentle wisdom, and Sunday morning pancakes. I could share the good parts of the life Helena had built after leaving them, the ways she'd learned to love more deeply and consistently than maybe she'd known how to do before. Or I could tell them the harder truth, that Helena had replaced them with me, that whatever had driven her away from her first family had been so powerful that she'd chosen to start over entirely, rather than try to fix whatever had been broken. I thought about Michael, who'd spent years tracking down a mother who'd been living just a few states away. I thought about Emma, who'd probably wondered every day of her adult life whether her mother was alive or dead, whether she'd done something wrong, whether there was some way she could have prevented her mother's disappearance. And I thought about myself, sitting in a house that belonged to a woman whose real name I'd never even known, surrounded by photo albums that revealed a family history I'd never been part of. Everything I'd believed about my place in Helena's life had been built on the assumption that I was all she had left. Now I knew that wasn't true. I was what she'd chosen instead of what she'd lost. The phone felt heavy in my hands as I scrolled through the contact information for Emma Rodriguez. One phone call would change everything. It would give Helena's children the closure they'd been seeking for over 15 years. It would answer questions that had probably haunted them through marriages and career changes, and the birth of children Helena would never meet. But it would also mean admitting that the woman who'd raised me had been someone else entirely before she'd become my Aunt Helena. It would mean sharing her with people who had a claim to her that was older and deeper than mine. It would mean acknowledging that my entire childhood had been built on the foundation of someone else's family tragedy. As I sat there in the darkness, I realized that this was bigger than just deciding whether to make a phone call. This was about choosing what kind of person I wanted to be going forward. Did I want to be someone who protected comfortable lies, or someone who had the courage to face difficult truths? Did I want to honor Helena's deception, or did I want to honor the people she'd left behind? I thought about what Helena herself would want me to do. The woman who'd raised me had always emphasized the importance of doing what was right, even when it was hard. She'd taught me that integrity meant being honest, even when honesty came at a personal cost. Of course, now I knew that she'd been living in direct contradiction to those values for the entire time I'd known her. But maybe that was exactly why this decision mattered so much. Maybe this was my chance to live up to the principles she'd taught me, even if she hadn't been able to live up to them herself. I looked around Helena's living room one more time, taking in the life she'd built in Salem. The bookshelves filled with novels and gardening guides. The piano where she'd tried unsuccessfully to teach me to play. The kitchen where she'd made thousands of meals with patient love. The photographs on the mantel that showed our life together. My high school graduation, college acceptance letter. The day I'd gotten my first real job. This had been a real life, filled with real love and real commitment. Whatever Helena's reasons for leaving her first family, she'd used the second chance she'd given herself to become a better person, a more devoted parent, a woman who'd loved me with a consistency and depth that had shaped everything good about who I'd become. But that didn't change the fact that Emma and Michael deserved to know what had happened to their mother. They deserved to understand that her disappearance hadn't been about them, that whatever had driven her away had been powerful enough to make her feel like starting over was the only option. I picked up my phone and dialed Emma's number before I could lose my courage. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, cautious and tired. "Hello? Is this Emma Rodriguez?" My voice came out smaller than I'd intended, barely above a whisper. "Yes, who's calling?" I took a deep breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. "My name is Jessica Martinez. I'm calling about your mother, Helen." The silence that followed was so complete I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like a chair scraping against the floor. "What about my mother?" Emma's voice had changed completely, becoming urgent and desperate. "Do you know something? Is she alive?" The hope in her voice cut through me like glass. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "She passed away 3 weeks ago. I'm so sorry." Emma made a sound that was part sob, part gasp. I heard her call out to someone in the background. "Michael, get over here right now." And then the rustle of movement, voices conferring in hushed, frantic tones. "Where?" Emma's voice was thick with tears now. "Where did she die? Where has she been all these years?" "Salem, Oregon. She'd been living here since 2007. She went by Helena Santos here, not Helen Martinez." "Helena Santos," Emma repeated, testing the unfamiliar name. "Who are you? How did you know her?" This was the part I'd been dreading. "She was my aunt. She raised me from the time I was 12. I had no idea about you or Michael or your father until I found photo albums in her house today." Another long silence. Then Emma's voice, flat and disbelieving. "Your aunt." I thought I was her only family. My parents died in a car accident in 2012 and Helena took me in. She told me she was my father's sister, that she'd moved to Oregon after caring for our sick grandmother in Iowa. I believed her completely. Jesus Christ. This was a man's voice now, close to the phone. "Michael. She was raising some random kid while Dad was—" "Michael, stop." Emma's voice was sharp. "Can you come here, to Bakersfield? We need to talk in person. There are things you need to see, things you need to understand about why she left." The weight of what she was suggesting hit me like a physical blow. Drive to California to meet the family Helena had abandoned. Sit in their living room and explain how their mother had built an entirely new life while they'd spent 15 years wondering if she was dead or alive. Face the children she'd left behind and somehow justify why she'd chosen me instead of fighting to fix whatever had been broken in her first family. "I don't know if that's a good idea," I said slowly. "This is already so complicated and I'm not sure." "Please." Emma's voice cracked. "My brother has been looking for her for over a decade. My dad died 3 years ago, still believing she might come home someday. We buried him with her wedding ring because he refused to give up hope. We need to understand what happened. We need to know who she became after she left us." I looked around Helena's living room, at the careful life she'd constructed in Salem, the books she'd read, the plants she'd tended, the photographs of our shared life together. In just a few hours, this space had transformed from a memorial to the woman who'd raised me into evidence of an elaborate deception. Everything here represented a choice she'd made to love me instead of returning to the family she'd left behind. "There's something else," I said, my voice barely audible. She knew Michael had found her. I found photos of him watching the house, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. She never acknowledged him, never let him know she knew he was there. Emma's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "He told me he thought he'd seen her once, at a coffee shop downtown, but he wasn't sure." "When was this?" "The photos are dated over the last 2 years. He was here multiple times. The last photo was taken 6 weeks before she died. He was standing at her front door, but her car wasn't here." "Oh, God!" Emma's voice broke completely. "Michael, did you hear that?" "She knew. She knew you were there, and I heard Michael's voice in the background, but couldn't make out the words. Then Emma came back on the line, her tone more controlled, but edged with something that might have been anger. "We're driving up there tomorrow. My brother needs to see this house, needs to understand what her life looked like, and you need to tell us everything about the woman you knew, because the mother who raised us would never have just disappeared without a word. Something happened to change her, and we need to know what it was." After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, trying to process what I'd just set in motion. In less than 24 hours, Helena's children would be standing in this house, seeing the life she'd built after abandoning them. They'd see the photos of my graduation on the mantle, the kitchen where she'd made my favorite meals, the room where she'd helped me with homework night after night for 5 years. And I'd have to explain how the woman who'd left them had become the most loving, consistent, devoted parent I could have imagined. How the person who'd caused them years of pain and confusion had been my anchor, my safe harbor, the reason I'd been able to survive losing my own parents and build a stable adult life. I walked through the house, seeing it through their eyes. Helena's bedroom, where she'd sewn costumes for my school plays and stayed up late helping me prepare for college applications. The guest room, where she'd let me have sleepovers and never complained about the noise. The backyard, where she'd taught me to garden, and where we'd sat on summer evenings talking about books and dreams and the future. Every corner of this house represented love and stability, and the quiet domestic happiness that had made me feel like the luckiest person in the world to have Helena as my family. But now I knew that all of this had been built on a foundation of abandonment and lies. I found myself wondering what Helena's life in Bakersfield had been like before she'd left. The photos suggested a normal, happy family, but people don't usually walk away from normal and happy. Something had driven her to such desperation that starting over with a new identity had seemed like the only option. Had she been unhappy in her marriage? Had there been some kind of crisis or trauma that made staying impossible? Or had she simply grown tired of the responsibility, the daily grind of raising children, and being accountable to people who needed her? The thought made me sick, but I couldn't shake it. Maybe Helena had left because she'd wanted freedom, and taking me in 5 years later had been a different kind of choice. 1 child instead of 2, a teenager instead of little kids, a manageable commitment instead of the overwhelming responsibility of a full family. But that didn't align with the woman I'd known. Helena had been devoted to me in ways that went far beyond obligation. She'd attended every school event, remembered every important date, made sacrifices for my happiness that she never complained about. The love she'd shown me had been real and deep, and consistent in ways that suggested someone who'd learned something important about commitment and family. I spent the night going through Helena's personal papers, looking for any clue about why she'd left Bakersfield. Her financial records showed a clean break in late 2007. Bank accounts closed in California, new accounts opened in Oregon, no overlap or gradual transition. She'd severed every connection to her old life in one decisive cut. There were no letters from her former family, no photos from before 1987 hidden in other places in the house, no diary or journal that might explain her motivation. It was as if Helena Santos had sprung into existence fully formed in Salem, with no past and no regrets about what she'd left behind. The only thing I found that seemed potentially significant was a business card tucked into the back of her address book. Dr. Patricia Reeves, marriage and family counselor, with a Bakersfield address and a phone number. The card was worn, as if it had been handled frequently, and there was a handwritten note on the back. Tuesdays 3 p.m., emergency appointments available. Helena had been in therapy before she'd left. Whatever had driven her away from her family had been serious enough to require professional help. But apparently, even therapy hadn't been enough to save her marriage or keep her from walking away from her children. The next morning, I woke up on Helena's couch surrounded by photo albums and papers, my neck stiff and my mind heavy with dread about the day ahead. I'd barely had time to shower and make coffee before I heard car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the window, I saw a man and woman walking toward the front door, both moving with the cautious tension of people approaching something they'd thought about for years, but never imagined they'd actually experience. Michael was tall, like his father had been in the photos, with Helena's dark eyes and the same stubborn set to his jaw that I recognized from looking in mirrors. Emma was smaller, more delicate, but carried herself with a confidence that reminded me of Helena's quiet strength. I opened the door before they could knock, and for a moment we all just stared at each other. They were looking at me with the same mixture of curiosity and wariness that I was feeling toward them. We were strangers, but we were also connected in the most complicated way possible, through a woman who'd loved us all but had never been honest with any of us about who she really was. "You look like her," Emma said softly, studying my face. "Not exactly, but something around the eyes." "People used to tell us that," I replied, then immediately felt awkward about claiming that resemblance when I now knew it had been coincidental. "Would you like to come in?" Michael hadn't said anything yet, just stood there taking in the details of Helena's front porch, the hanging plants she'd tended so carefully, the welcome mat that said "Home Sweet Home," the wind chimes that had caught my attention the first time I'd visited as a 12-year-old. "She always loved wind chimes," he said finally, his voice rough. "Had them all over our backyard in Bakersfield. Drove the neighbors crazy, but she said they reminded her of her childhood." I led them into the living room, where the photo albums were still stacked on the coffee table where I'd left them the night before. Emma saw them immediately and moved toward them like a magnet, but stopped herself before touching them. "Are those?" "The albums I found yesterday, the ones with pictures of your family." I gestured toward the couch. "Please, sit down. I'll make coffee and we can look through them together." "I need to see the house first," Michael said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I need to see where she lived, how she lived. I've been imagining this place for 2 years." I nodded and stepped back, watching as they moved through Helena's home with the careful attention of archaeologists examining artifacts from a lost civilization. Emma picked up the framed photo of my college graduation from the mantel, studying it with an expression I couldn't read. Michael stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the small table where Helena and I had eaten breakfast together hundreds of times. "She kept the same dishes," Emma murmured, running her finger along the edge of a blue ceramic bowl. "These were our everyday plates when we were kids." "And she still made pancakes on Sundays," Michael added, opening the cabinet where Helena kept her cooking supplies. "I can smell the vanilla extract. She always used too much vanilla extract." They moved through the house like people revisiting a place from a dream, recognizing familiar elements but struggling to reconcile them with the completely different context. This was their mother's life, but it was also a life that had deliberately excluded them for 15 years. When we finally settled in the living room with coffee, Emma picked up the first photo album with hands that shook slightly. The first picture was the one of Helen, standing in front of the house in Salem on her first day there. Emma stared at it for a long time before speaking. "She looks different here. Older, but also somehow lighter? Like she was relieved about something." I thought about Helena's face in the Bakersfield photos compared to how she'd looked during the years I'd known her. There had been a sadness in the earlier pictures that I hadn't noticed until Emma pointed out its absence. Helena had carried some burden during her first life that had been lifted by the time she'd started her second one. "What was she like before she left?" I asked. "Was she unhappy? Were your parents having problems?" Michael and Emma exchanged a look that was heavy with shared knowledge and old pain. "They fought sometimes," Emma said carefully. "Not screaming matches, but these intense, quiet arguments that would go on for days. Usually about money, or about Mom wanting to go back to school, or about Dad working too much. She wanted to be a nurse," Michael added. "Had wanted to be one since before Emma and I were born, but Dad thought it was impractical with 2 kids. He made good money as an electrician and thought Mom should focus on the family. But it was more than that," Emma continued, her voice getting stronger as she warmed to the subject. "Mom felt trapped, I think. She loved us, but she also felt like she'd given up too much of herself to be a wife and mother. She used to say she felt invisible, like she'd disappeared into this role and couldn't find her way back to who she'd been before." I thought about Helena's life in Salem, living alone, pursuing her interests, volunteering at the animal shelter, taking art classes at the community college. She'd created a life that was entirely her own choice, with none of the obligations or compromises that had apparently made her feel suffocated in her first marriage. "The therapy helped for a while," Michael said, noticing the business card I'd left on the coffee table. "Dr. Reeves was great. Mom seemed happier for a few months, more like herself. But then, something changed." "What happened?" Emma's face darkened. Dad found out about the money. What money? Mom had been saving, Michael explained. Taking cash back from grocery runs, selling things on eBay, putting away every dollar she could without Dad noticing. She'd saved almost $8,000 over 3 years. She told Dr. Reeves she was planning to leave, Emma continued. Said she needed to get out before she completely lost herself, but she wanted to make sure we'd be okay financially before she went. I felt like the ground was shifting under me. She was planning to leave? It wasn't just an impulsive decision? She'd been planning it for at least a year before she actually did it, Michael said, his voice bitter. Dr. Reeves told us after she disappeared. Mom had made her promise not to say anything while she was still coming to sessions, but after she vanished, Dr. Reeves thought we deserved to know that it hadn't been sudden. But why didn't she take you with her? The question came out before I could stop it, and immediately I wished I could take it back. The pain that flashed across both their faces was devastating. Because we would have slowed her down, Emma said quietly. Because taking us would have meant Dad could track her through school records and custody arrangements. Because she wanted freedom, not a different version of the same responsibility. She loved us, Michael added, but his voice lacked conviction. I know she loved us, but she loved the idea of escaping more. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of Helena's choices settling over us like fog. She'd planned her escape carefully, saved money deliberately, prepared for months to disappear completely from the lives of people who depended on her. But 5 years later, she'd taken in a grieving 12-year-old and committed to raising me with a devotion that had never wavered. The thing that kills me, Emma said, picking up another photo album, is that she found a way to be a good mother after she left us. Look at these pictures of you two together. She looks so happy, so present. She figured out how to love someone consistently, but she couldn't figure out how to do that for us. I wanted to defend Helena, to explain that the woman who'd raised me had been kind and patient and selfless in ways that suggested someone who'd learned from past mistakes. But looking at Emma and Michael, seeing the pain that 15 years hadn't been able to heal, I realized that my experience of Helena's love was inseparable from their experience of her abandonment. Tell us about her, Michael said suddenly. Tell us who she became after she left us. I need to know if she was happy. So I told them about Helena's life in Salem, about her work at the animal shelter and her volunteer reading program at the elementary school, about her garden and her book club, and the way she made friends easily but kept most people at a comfortable distance, about her Sunday morning pancakes and her terrible singing voice, and her habit of talking to her plants like they were people. I told them about how she'd taken me in without hesitation when social services had called, how she'd transformed her quiet, solitary life to make room for a traumatized teenager without ever making me feel like a burden, how she'd attended every school event and helped with homework, and listened to my problems with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like the most important person in the world. She sounds like she became the mother we always wanted her to be, Emma said when I finished, her voice thick with tears. But she had to leave us to figure out how to do it. The truth of that statement hung in the air like an accusation. Helena had needed to escape her first family in order to become the kind of person who could love me properly. My happiness had been built on their loss, my stability on their abandonment. There's something else, Michael said, pulling out his phone. Something I haven't told anyone, not even Emma. He showed us a photo on his phone, Helena sitting on a bench at what looked like a shopping mall, completely absorbed in reading a book. But what made my breath catch was the date stamp, December 2019. I saw her when I was visiting friends in Portland, Michael explained. I'd driven down to Salem on a whim, just to see if I could find any trace of her. I was walking through the mall and there she was, just sitting there reading like any normal person. I watched her for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to approach her. Why didn't you? I asked. Because she looked so peaceful, so content. And I realized that if I walked over there, if I forced her to acknowledge me, I'd be destroying whatever life she'd built for herself. I thought maybe it was enough just to know she was alive and okay. Emma stared at her brother with a mixture of admiration and frustration. You've been carrying that for 3 years? You knew she was alive and you didn't tell me. I was trying to protect you, Michael said defensively. You'd just had Thomas, you were dealing with postpartum depression, and I didn't want to open up all those old wounds if she was just going to reject us again." "That wasn't your choice to make," Emma shot back. "She was my mother too. I had a right to know." Watching them argue, I saw the deep scars that Helena's departure had left on their relationship with each other. They'd been children when she'd left, and they'd had to learn how to be a family without her, how to support each other through the confusion and abandonment she'd left behind. Even now, as adults, they were still struggling with the after effects of her choices. "Did she seem happy?" I asked Michael. "When you saw her in Portland?" He thought for a moment. "She seemed settled, like she'd found her place in the world. But there was also something sad about her. Something I remembered from when we were kids. Like she was carrying some weight that never quite went away." I thought about Helena during my teenage years, about the moments when I'd catch her staring out the window with a distant expression, or the way she sometimes got quiet around Mother's Day, or during movies about families. I'd always assumed she was thinking about her parents, or missing some abstract idea of family from her past. Now I wondered if she'd been thinking about Emma and Michael, about the children she'd left behind and the grandchild she'd never met. "She kept every newspaper clipping about your achievements," I said suddenly, remembering something I'd found in her desk drawer. "Your college graduation announcement, Emma. The article about Michael making partner at his law firm. Your wedding announcement. She must have had some way of keeping track of you." Emma's eyes widened. "She knew I got married? She knew about my career?" "She had a whole folder of clippings. Articles about your father's death. Pictures from your social media accounts that someone must have printed for her. She was keeping track of your lives from a distance. So she cared enough to follow our lives, but not enough to be part of them," Michael said bitterly. We spent the rest of the day going through Helena's belongings together, and with each discovery, the picture of who she'd been became more complicated. They found books she'd owned that they remembered from their childhood, recipes written in her handwriting that she'd apparently never made again after leaving Bakersfield, and a jewelry box containing the earrings Emma had given her for Mother's Day in 2006. But they also found evidence of the life she'd built without them. Thank you cards from the families of children she'd helped learn to read. Photos from her book club's monthly outings. A certificate recognizing her volunteer work at the animal shelter. Helena had created a rich, meaningful life in Salem, but it was a life that had deliberately excluded the family she'd started with. As evening approached, we sat around Helena's kitchen table eating takeout Chinese food and trying to process everything we'd learned about each other and about the woman who'd connected us. The conversation had moved beyond the immediate shock and pain into something more complex, a shared attempt to understand why Helena had made the choices she'd made and what those choices meant for all of us going forward. "I think she was a coward," Emma said finally, her voice matter-of-fact rather than angry. "I think she loved us, but she also loved herself more, and when she couldn't figure out how to be happy as our mother, she chose to be happy without us." "But she learned something from that choice," I offered. "When she took me in, she was a different person. More patient, more present, more committed. Maybe leaving you taught her something about what it meant to love someone properly." "That's a nice way to think about it," Michael said, "but it doesn't change the fact that we paid the price for her education. We were the practice family she had to mess up before she could get it right with you." The words stung because they contained an uncomfortable truth. Helena had been a better mother to me than she'd apparently been able to be to Emma and Michael, but only because she'd learned from the experience of abandoning them. My stable, loving childhood had been built on the foundation of their loss. "What happens now?" Emma asked as we finished eating. "What do we do with all this?" It was a good question. We were 3 adults connected by a woman who'd loved us all but had never been honest with any of us about the full scope of her life. We'd spent one day together processing 15 years of lies and abandonment and complicated love, but that didn't make us family. It just made us fellow survivors of Helena's choices. "I'd like to stay in touch," I said carefully. "I'd like to know Thomas, and I'd like you to have some of Helena's things if you want them. But I also understand if this is too complicated, if knowing about me just makes everything harder." "You're our sister," Michael said simply. Not biologically, but in every way that matters. She raised you the way she should have raised us. That makes you family. Whether any of us knows how to handle that or not." Emma nodded, tears starting to flow again. "I want Thomas to know about his grandmother, but I also want him to know that she was capable of love, even if she couldn't figure out how to show it consistently. You're proof that she learned how to do better." We made plans to stay in touch, to navigate this complicated new relationship slowly and carefully. Emma and Michael would take some of Helena's belongings back to Bakersfield, the dishes they remembered. From childhood, some of her books, the jewelry box with the earrings. I would keep the house and most of her things, but I'd also keep the door open for them to visit whenever they needed to feel close to the woman who'd been their mother first. But as they packed their car to drive back to California, I realized that nothing would ever be simple about my relationship with Helena's memory. I couldn't think of her as just my loving aunt anymore, but I also couldn't think of her as a villain who'd heartlessly abandoned her children. She was something more complex, a woman who'd made choices that had caused tremendous pain, but who'd also used those choices to become someone capable of tremendous love. I watched Emma and Michael drive away, and then I went back into Helena's house, my house now, and sat in her favorite chair by the window. The photo albums were still scattered across the coffee table, but now they told a different story than they had 24 hours ago. They weren't evidence of deception anymore. They were evidence of the full complexity of a human life, with all its mistakes and growth and impossible choices. Helena had left her children because she couldn't figure out how to be happy as their mother. But she'd taken me in because she'd learned that love required presence and commitment, and the willingness to put someone else's needs first. I was the beneficiary of her hard-won wisdom, but Emma and Michael were the ones who'd paid the price for her to acquire it. As I sat there in the quiet house, I realized that I was going to have to find a way to live with that truth. Helena had been the most important person in my life, but she'd also been responsible for some of the deepest pain in Emma's and Michael's lives. Both things were true, and neither canceled out the other. The woman who'd made me pancakes every Sunday morning was the same woman who'd walked away from her children without explanation. The person who'd taught me about integrity and kindness was the same person who'd built her entire life around an elaborate lie. I was going to have to find a way to love her memory while also acknowledging the harm she'd caused to people I was now beginning to care about. It was going to be complicated. But maybe that was okay. Maybe love was supposed to be complicated, especially when it came to family. Maybe the point wasn't to figure out whether Helena had been a good person or a bad person, but to understand that she'd been a human person, capable of both tremendous selfishness and tremendous devotion, sometimes within the same choice. I looked around the living room one more time, at the life Helena had built in Salem, and the evidence of the life she'd left behind in Bakersfield. Tomorrow, I'd have to start figuring out how to honor both versions of her, how to grieve the woman who'd raised me while also acknowledging the pain she'd caused the children she'd abandoned. But tonight, I was just going to sit in her chair and remember the Sunday mornings when she'd taught me that family was about showing up for each other, even when it was hard. She'd been wrong about a lot of things, but she'd been right about that. And now it was my turn to show up, for Emma and Michael and little Thomas, and for the complicated legacy of the woman who'd loved us all in the only ways she'd known how. 3 weeks after Emma and Michael's visit, I was back at my job in Portland, trying to pretend that my world hadn't been completely upended. I had returned to my apartment, my routine, my normal life, but everything felt different now. I couldn't look at family photos without wondering what secrets might be hidden behind the smiles. I couldn't hear stories about childhood without questioning what parts might be fabricated. Helena's deception had shattered something fundamental about my ability to trust my own memories. My coworkers at the design agency noticed the change. Sarah, who sat at the desk next to mine, kept asking if I was okay, if I needed more time off after my aunt's death. I wanted to tell her that the problem wasn't grief. It was the discovery that grief itself was more complicated than I'd ever imagined. How do you mourn someone who'd been both completely honest and completely dishonest with you? How do you process love that had been real, but built on a foundation of lies? I'd been staying in touch with Emma and Michael through text messages and occasional phone calls, but the conversations were stilted, careful. We were all trying to figure out how to navigate this strange new relationship we'd been thrust into. They'd invited me to visit Bakersfield, to see the house where Helena had lived her first life, but I'd been putting off making plans. Part of me wasn't sure I was ready to see the place she'd abandoned to build a life with me. But then Emma sent me a text that changed everything. Found something in Dad's papers. You need to see this. Can you come down this weekend? The urgency in her message made my stomach clench with anxiety. What else could there be? What other secrets had Helena kept that we hadn't discovered yet? I drove to Bakersfield on Friday evening, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe Helena had been in contact with Robert before his death. Maybe there were letters explaining her decision to leave. Maybe there was some detail about their marriage that would finally make sense of why she'd felt escape was her only option. Emma and Michael met me at a coffee shop near their childhood home, both looking tense and exhausted. Emma had a manila folder clutched in her hands, and Michael looked like he hadn't slept in days. "What did you find?" I asked as soon as I sat down. Emma opened the folder and pulled out a stack of legal documents. These were in a safety deposit box we didn't know Dad had. The bank called last week about overdue fees. She spread the papers across the table, and I saw immediately why they'd been so urgent about getting me here. The documents were custody agreements, divorce papers, and child support calculations, all dated December 2007, all signed by both Robert Martinez and Helen Martinez. They got divorced, I said, stating the obvious but still struggling to process it. Not just divorced, Michael said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Look at the custody arrangement. I read through the legal language, my confusion growing with each paragraph. According to the documents, Helena had voluntarily relinquished all parental rights to Emma and Michael. She'd agreed to a divorce settlement that gave her nothing, no property, no alimony, no visitation rights. In exchange, Robert had agreed not to pursue her for child support. I don't understand, I said. This makes it look like the divorce was mutual, like you all agreed to this arrangement. That's what we thought too, until we found this. Emma pulled out another document, this one handwritten on lined notebook paper. It was a letter, addressed to Robert, written in Helena's careful script. Read it out loud, Michael said. I can't. I've tried 3 times and I can't get through it. I took the letter with shaking hands and began to read. Robert, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know this is the most selfish thing I could possibly do, but I also know it's the only thing that will save all of us from years of misery. I've been pretending to be happy for so long that I've forgotten what actual happiness feels like. I wake up every morning feeling like I'm suffocating, like the walls of our life are closing in on me a little more each day. I know you think this is about you, about our marriage, but it's not. You're a good man and a wonderful father. The problem is me. I never learned how to be content with the life we built together. I keep wanting something more, something different, something that probably doesn't even exist. But I can't stop wanting it, and that wanting is poisoning everything good about our family. Emma is old enough now that she doesn't really need me anymore. She has her friends and her activities and her plans for college. Michael still needs a parent, but he needs one who can be present and patient and focused on his happiness, instead of constantly wishing she was somewhere else. He needs you, not a mother who's counting down the minutes until she can escape to her car and drive somewhere, anywhere, just to feel like she can breathe again. I've been in therapy for 2 years trying to figure out how to fix what's wrong with me, but Dr. Reeves thinks some people just aren't meant for the kind of life we've built. She says I have what she calls quote, restlessness, that I might need a completely different environment to figure out how to be okay with myself. I can't keep putting our children through the emotional roller coaster of having a mother who loves them but resents the life that loving them requires. The divorce papers give you everything, the house, full custody, all our savings, except for the money I've been setting aside. I don't want anything from this life except the freedom to figure out who I'm supposed to be when I'm not somebody's wife and mother. Maybe that makes me a terrible person. Maybe I'll regret this decision for the rest of my life. But I know I'll regret staying even more. Please don't try to find me. Please don't let the children think this is their fault. Tell them I loved them. as much as I was capable of loving anyone, but that I loved them enough to give them a mother who could be better than I was. Tell them that sometimes people have to leave in order to save the people they're hurting by staying. I'm sorry, Robert. I'm sorry I couldn't be who you needed me to be. I'm sorry I couldn't learn how to be happy with a life that should have been enough for anyone. I hope someday you'll understand that this is the most loving thing I could do for all of you. Helen. The silence that followed was deafening. I set the letter down with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. My eyes blurred with tears I didn't know how to process. This wasn't the story of a woman who'd impulsively abandoned her family. This was the story of someone who'd been drowning in her own life and had convinced herself that disappearing was an act of love. She thought she was saving us, Emma said, her voice hollow. She thought we'd be better off without her. Dr. Reeves said essentially the same thing when we went to see her after we found these papers, Michael added. She said Mom was convinced that her unhappiness was damaging us, that we could feel her resentment even when she tried to hide it. I thought about Helena's life in Salem, about the peace I'd always sensed in her, the way she'd seemed so comfortable in her own skin. She'd found the environment Dr. Reeves had thought she needed, the space to figure out who she was supposed to be. But it had taken abandoning her children to get there. There's more, Emma said, pulling out another set of documents. These are from a private investigator Dad hired in 2015. The PI's report was thorough and devastating. He'd tracked Helena's movements from Bakersfield to Salem, documented her name change, her job at the animal shelter, her volunteer work. He'd found records of her taking me in after my parents' death, photos of us together at school events, evidence of the stable, loving life she'd built as my guardian. But the most painful part of the report was the conclusion. Subject appears to have successfully integrated into her new community and established strong familial bonds with her ward. Recommend against contact, as subject has clearly moved on from her previous life and seems to have found the stability she was seeking. Dad knew, Michael said quietly. He knew she was alive, he knew she was raising you, and he chose not to pursue it. Why didn't he tell you? Because he loved us, Emma replied, wiping tears from her cheeks. Because he could see that she was happy and settled, and he didn't want to destroy that happiness or risk putting us through another abandonment if she rejected us again. I stared at the private investigator's report, at the photos of Helena and me at my high school graduation, at the careful documentation of the life we'd built together. From the outside, we must have looked like any normal aunt and niece, but this report revealed the truth. Helena had used me to practice being the kind of mother she'd never been able to be for Emma and Michael. She became the parent she should have been for us, Michael said, voicing what we were all thinking. She figured out how to be present and patient and selfless, but only after she'd given up on trying to do that for her own children. The weight of that realization was crushing. Every memory I had of Helena's love and devotion now felt complicated by the knowledge that Emma and Michael had never experienced that version of her. She'd learned how to be a good mother by abandoning them, and I'd been the beneficiary of that hard-won wisdom. I need to see the house, I said suddenly. I need to see where she lived before, where you grew up. Emma and Michael exchanged a glance. Are you sure? It might be harder than you think. Everything about this is harder than I think. But I need to understand what she was running from. We drove to their childhood home in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts about the woman who'd connected our lives in such a painful way. The house was a modest ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood, with a large backyard and the kind of mature landscaping that suggested people who'd planned to stay for a long time. Robert still lived there when he died, Michael explained as we pulled into the driveway. The new owners had been understanding about them occasionally visiting to collect forgotten items or just to remember their father. They'd agreed to let us walk through one more time before Emma and Michael stopped coming back entirely. The current owners, a young couple with toddlers, welcomed us warmly and gave us space to explore. Walking through the rooms where Helena had lived her first life was surreal and heartbreaking. The layout was similar to her house in Salem, but everything felt heavier somehow, more closed in. The windows seemed smaller, the rooms more cramped. the whole space less conducive to the kind of peace I'd always associated with Helena. She redecorated 3 times while we lived here, Emma said as we stood in what had been the living room. She was always moving furniture around, painting walls, trying to make the space feel different. Dad thought it was just restlessness, but now I think she was trying to redesign her way into happiness. In Michael's old bedroom, I found myself trying to imagine Helena tucking him in at night, reading him stories, helping him with homework. Had she been present for those moments, or had her mind always been somewhere else, planning her escape? She was a good mom when she was focused on us, Michael said, as if reading my thoughts. The problem was that she could only focus for short periods of time, before her mind would start wandering to all the things she wasn't doing, all the places she wasn't going, all the versions of herself she wasn't exploring. The backyard was where I finally understood what Helena had been running from. It was beautiful. Well-maintained flower beds, a vegetable garden, a patio with outdoor furniture arranged for family gatherings, but it was also completely enclosed by a high wooden fence that blocked the view of anything beyond the property. Standing there, I could imagine how someone with chronic restlessness might feel trapped by all that domestic perfection. She used to stand out here for hours, Emma said, joining me by the fence, just staring at the boards like she was trying to see through them. Dad built this fence the year before she left because she complained about the neighbors being able to see into our yard. But I think it just made her feel more trapped. We found a storage shed in the corner of the backyard that the new owners had said we could clean out. Inside, covered by dusty tarps, was furniture that had clearly been Helena's. A writing desk with pigeonholes full of dried-up pens and yellowed paper. A bookshelf stacked with novels about women who'd left their old lives behind to find adventure. A hope chest filled with brochures for colleges she'd never attended, and travel destinations she'd never visited. At the bottom of the hope chest, wrapped in tissue paper, was a baby book, Emma's baby book, filled with Helena's careful documentation of every milestone, every first word and first step and first day of school. The last entry was dated 3 months before Helena had left. Emma got her driver's license today. She's so independent now, so ready for the world. Sometimes I watch her and wonder if I was ever that confident about what I wanted from life. Underneath Emma's baby book was Michael's, equally detailed but with a different tone in the later entries. Michael asked me today why I seemed sad all the time. I told him I wasn't sad, just tired, but that was a lie. I am sad. I'm sad that this beautiful life we've built doesn't feel like enough. I'm sad that I love my children but resent the way loving them has limited every other possibility. I'm sad that I'm not the mother they deserve. Reading those entries, I finally understood what had driven Helena away. It wasn't that she hadn't loved Emma and Michael. It was that she'd loved them while simultaneously grieving the person she might have been if she'd never become their mother. That grief had poisoned her ability to be present for them, had made her feel like she was failing them, even when she was trying her hardest to be what they needed. She loved you, I said to Emma and Michael as we packed up the baby books. These entries make it clear how much she loved you, but she also felt guilty about not being happier about loving you, and that guilt made everything worse. Do you think she was happier after she left? Emma asked. Do you think she found what she was looking for? I thought about Helena's life in Salem, about the contentment I'd always sensed in her, the way she'd seemed so comfortable with herself and her choices. I think she found peace, I said carefully. But I also think that peace came at a terrible cost. As we prepared to leave the house for the last time, Michael stopped in what had been his parents' bedroom. There's something else, he said, opening the closet door. Something I've never shown anyone. Hidden behind a loose board in the back of the closet was a small metal box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Emma and Michael, all dated after Helena had left. She kept writing to us, Michael said, his voice breaking. For 10 years, she wrote us letters on our birthdays, on holidays, whenever something important happened in her life. But she never sent them. I opened one of the letters, dated on Emma's 18th birthday. My darling Emma, you're 18 today, officially an adult, and I'm sitting in my garden in Salem writing you a letter I'll never send. I wonder if you had a party, if Dad made you the chocolate cake with raspberry filling that you always loved. I wonder if you still bite your nails when you're nervous, if you still read 3 books at once, if you still dream about traveling to Ireland like we talked about when you were 12. I know I have no right to wonder about these things. I know I gave up the privilege of knowing you when I chose to leave. But I can't stop thinking about the young woman you're becoming. Can't stop hoping that you're happy and confident and ready to take on the world. I'm different now than I was when you knew me. I've learned how to be still, how to find joy in small things, how to be present for the people I love. I wish I could have learned those things while I was still your mother. I wish I could have figured out how to be happy with the life we had instead of always wanting something else. But I also know that my leaving gave you something I never could have given you by staying. A mother who is present and engaged and thrilled to be part of your daily life. I know Dad remarried, and I know Sarah loves you like her own daughter. That makes me happier than I can express, even though it also breaks my heart. I hope someday you'll understand that leaving you was the most loving thing I could do. I hope you'll forgive me for not being strong enough to learn how to love you properly while I was still part of your life. I hope you'll know that not a single day passes without me thinking about you and wishing things could have been different. Happy birthday, my beautiful girl. I love you more than I ever knew how to show you. Mom. There were letters for Michael, too, documenting his progression from a confused 8-year-old to a successful adult. Letters filled with pride and regret and a love that had never diminished, despite the distance Helena had created between them. She never stopped being our mother, Emma said, tears streaming down her face. She just learned how to be a better mother from far away. We sat in that empty bedroom, surrounded by a decade's worth of letters Helena had written but never sent, and I realized that we'd finally found the missing piece of her story. She hadn't abandoned her children callously or moved on from them easily. She'd carried them with her every day, had continued to love them and worry about them and celebrate their achievements from a distance. But she'd also known that her love came with too much guilt and resentment to be healthy for any of them. So she'd learned how to love them by letting them go, and then she'd used what she'd learned about love to be a better parent to me. What do we do now? Michael asked. What do we do with all this? It was the same question Emma had asked after their first visit to Salem, but now it carried different weight. We weren't just 3 people connected by a woman who'd lied to all of us. We were 3 people who'd been loved by someone who'd been brave enough to sacrifice her own happiness, and eventually, her relationship with her own children, to become the kind of person who could love properly. I think we honor her, I said slowly. All of her. The mother who left you because she thought it was best for you, and the mother who took me in because she'd learned how to put someone else's needs first, the woman who made mistakes and the woman who learned from them. I want Thomas to know about her, Emma said. I want him to know that his grandmother was complicated and flawed, but that she also figured out how to love people deeply. I want him to know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is the hardest thing you can imagine. And I want to stay in touch with you, Michael said to me. I want us to be family, the way she would have wanted us to be if she'd been brave enough to bring us all together while she was alive. We made plans to meet regularly, to share stories about Helena, and to build the relationship she'd never given us the chance to have while she was alive. Emma would bring Thomas to Salem so he could see where his grandmother had lived her second life. Michael would help me go through more of Helena's belongings, looking for traces of the woman she'd been before she'd learned how to be the woman I'd known. But as we prepared to leave the house where Helena had lived her first life, I realized that the most important thing we'd discovered wasn't in the letters or the baby books or the divorce papers. It was an understanding that love could be both selfish and selfless at the same time, that sometimes the most loving choice was also the most painful one, and that family could be something you chose rather than something you were born into. Helena had chosen to leave Emma and Michael, but she'd also chosen to take me in. She'd chosen to cut ties with her first family, but she'd also chosen to write them letters for 10 years. She'd chosen to build a new life, but she'd also chosen to carry the guilt and love from her old life with her every day. Those choices had been complicated and painful, and had caused tremendous hurt, but they'd also led to moments of profound love and connection and growth. My stable childhood with Helena had been built on the foundation of her children's loss, but it had also been the result of her determination to learn how to love better than she had before. As we drove away from the house for the last time, I looked back at the fenced yard where Helena had felt so trapped and thought about the open spaces of her garden in Salem. She'd found what she'd been looking for, but only after she'd been willing to give up everything she'd had before. Maybe that was the lesson she'd been trying to teach all of us without even realizing it. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything in order to find out who you're supposed to be. Sometimes love means making choices that hurt the people you care about most. And sometimes the most important family relationships are the ones you choose to build after everything else has fallen apart. Helena had been wrong about a lot of things, but she'd been right about the most important thing. Family was about showing up for the people who needed you, even when showing up meant making impossible choices. She'd shown up for me after failing to show up for Emma and Michael. Now it was our turn to show up for each other, to build something good from the complicated legacy she'd left behind. We had each other now, this strange family forged from secrets and loss, and the complicated love of a woman who'd never learned how to make easy choices. It wasn't the family any of us had expected, but maybe it was the family we all needed, one built on understanding and forgiveness, and the recognition that love could be messy and painful and transformative all at the same time. Helena was gone, but the love she'd learned how to give, imperfect and hard-won and complicated as it was, lived on in the connections she'd created between us. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. 6 months later, I was standing in the kitchen of Helena's house in Salem, teaching my 3-year-old nephew Thomas how to make pancakes. He stood on a step stool beside me, his small hands covered in flour, his face scrunched in concentration as he tried to crack an egg the way I'd shown him. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, the same comforting scents that had filled this space when Helena made breakfast for me every Sunday morning. "Like this, Aunt Jessie?" Thomas asked, holding up a piece of eggshell he'd successfully fished out of the bowl. "Perfect," I said, ruffling his dark hair that reminded me so much of Helena's. "Your Grandma Helena would be proud of you." Emma smiled from her seat at the kitchen table, where she was sorting through a box of Helena's recipe cards we'd found in the pantry. "He's been talking about making pancakes for weeks. I think you've created a monster." "A very cute monster," I replied, helping Thomas measure out the milk. "And one who's going to help us understand his grandma a little better." It had taken 6 months of careful, sometimes painful conversations, but Emma, Michael, and I had slowly begun to build something that felt like family. We'd established a routine of sorts, monthly visits, alternating between Salem and Bakersfield, with regular phone calls and text messages in between. We'd created space for Thomas to hear stories about the grandmother he'd never met, and we'd given ourselves permission to grieve the woman who'd connected us all in such a complicated way. The process hadn't been easy. There had been moments of anger and resentment, times when the weight of Helena's choices felt too heavy to bear. Emma had struggled with feeling replaced by me, with understanding how Helena could have been so devoted to a stranger's child while abandoning her own. Michael had wrestled with rage at his father for keeping Helena's location secret, for protecting her peace at the expense of their need for closure. And I had grappled with guilt that felt overwhelming at times. Guilt for having been loved by someone who'd withheld that love from her own children. Guilt for having benefited from choices that had caused so much pain. Guilt for having memories of happiness with someone who'd broken the hearts of people I was learning to love. But we'd worked through those feelings together, with the help of a family therapist Dr. Reeves had recommended. We'd learned that grief could coexist with anger, that love could survive the revelation of terrible choices, and that family could be something you built deliberately rather than something you inherited automatically. "Tell me about the pancakes," Thomas said as he stirred the batter with intense focus. "Tell me about Grandma Helena and the pancakes." I glanced at Emma, who nodded encouragingly. We'd agreed that Thomas should know about Helena, but we'd also agreed to tell him age-appropriate stories that emphasized her love rather than her mistakes. "Your Grandma Helena made the best pancakes in the whole world," I began, adding blueberries to the batter. Every Sunday morning, she would wake up early and mix up this special recipe that her grandmother had taught her. She would hum while she cooked, and the whole house would smell like vanilla and happiness. "Did she make them for my mommy too?" Thomas asked. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she answered. "She did, sweetheart. When Mommy was little, Grandma Helena made pancakes for her and Uncle Michael every Sunday, just like she did for Aunt Jessie. It was a small truth within a larger, more complicated story. Someday, when Thomas was older, we'd tell him about the years when Helena hadn't been there to make pancakes for his mother and uncle. We'd explain that sometimes people make choices that hurt the ones they love, even when they think they're doing the right thing. But for now, it was enough for him to know that he came from a family where love had been expressed through Sunday morning breakfasts, and the patient teaching of recipes passed down through generations. Michael arrived just as we were flipping the first batch of pancakes, carrying his girlfriend Sarah and a bouquet of flowers from Helena's favorite nursery. Sarah was a kindergarten teacher who'd been wonderfully patient with our complicated family dynamics, and she'd quickly become someone we all relied on for perspective and emotional support. "Something smells amazing," Michael said, lifting Thomas off the step stool for a hug. "Are you teaching Aunt Jessie your secret pancake technique?" "I'm teaching him Helena's technique," I corrected gently. "The one she taught me, which she learned from her grandmother." We'd developed this habit of being very deliberate about connecting our current experiences to Helena's memory. It was a way of honoring her while also acknowledging that her influence continued to shape our lives in positive ways, despite the pain her choices had caused. As we sat around the kitchen table eating pancakes and watching Thomas drizzle syrup with the intense concentration of a 3-year-old, I thought about how different this scene was from anything I could have imagined a year ago. Then, I'd been alone in this house, sorting through the belongings of the only family I thought I had. Now, the space was filled with the laughter and conversation of people who'd chosen to become family despite having every reason to resent each other. "I've been thinking about something," Emma said as she helped Thomas cut his pancakes into smaller pieces. "I want to do something with Mom's letters, the ones she wrote but never sent." Michael looked up from his coffee. "What kind of something?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe a book? Or a blog? Something that might help other people who are struggling with the choice between staying in a life that's making them miserable and leaving behind people they love." It was an idea we'd discussed before, but Emma had never seemed ready to pursue it seriously. Helena's letters were deeply personal, filled with insights about motherhood and sacrifice, and the complexity of love that felt too private to share with strangers. "What changed your mind?" I asked. Emma was quiet for a moment, watching Thomas work determinedly on his breakfast. "I keep thinking about all the people who might be where Mom was in 2007. Parents who love their children but feel trapped by the life that loving them requires. People who think leaving is the only way to save everyone from their unhappiness." "You think Mom's story could help them find a different solution?" Michael asked. "I think Mom's story could help them understand that there's no solution that doesn't involve pain," Emma replied. "But maybe there are ways to work through that pain without destroying everything good in your life. Maybe if she'd had access to the stories of other people who'd felt the way she felt, she might have found a different path." I thought about Helena's isolation in those final years before she'd left Bakersfield, about how she'd been carrying the weight of her unhappiness alone until it became unbearable. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe there was value in sharing her story, not as a cautionary tale but as a complex example of how love and sacrifice could be both destructive and redemptive. "I'd want to help," I said. "I have stories about who she became after she left, about how she used what she learned from leaving you to love me better. That feels like an important part of this story, too." Michael nodded slowly. "And I have Dad's perspective, from the private investigator's reports and from conversations we had before he died. The story of what it was like to be left behind, to rebuild a family after someone you love disappears." We spent the rest of the morning talking about what such a project might look like, how we could honor Helena's memory while also being honest about the damage her choices had caused. It felt like a way of taking something broken and painful and using it to create something potentially helpful for other families struggling with similar challenges. After lunch, while Thomas napped on the couch and the others read in the living room, I went out to Helena's garden. It was early spring, and the first shoots of the perennials she'd planted were beginning to emerge from the soil. I'd been learning to care for her plants over the winter, following the detailed notes she'd left in a gardening journal, trying to maintain the sanctuary she'd created in her backyard. The garden had become my favorite place to think about Helena and our complicated relationship. Here, surrounded by the flowers and herbs she'd tended so carefully, I could remember the woman who'd raised me without the shadow of the woman who'd abandoned Emma and Michael. Here, I could focus on the love she'd shown me without feeling guilty about the love she'd withheld from others. Sarah joined me by the herb garden, kneeling down to examine the new growth on the lavender plants. "You're getting good at this," she said, gesturing toward the healthy-looking shoots. Helena would be proud. "I keep thinking about what she'd make of all this," I said, pulling a few weeds from around the mint. Us being here together, Thomas learning to make her pancakes, Emma wanting to share her story with the world. "What do you think she'd say?" I considered the question seriously. I think she'd be amazed that we found each other, but also terrified that we'd judge her too harshly. She worked so hard to keep her two lives separate, to protect the peace she'd found in Salem, from the guilt she carried about Bakersfield. Do you judge her harshly? It was a question I'd been asking myself for months, and the answer kept evolving. I judge some of her choices harshly, I said carefully. I think leaving Emma and Michael was wrong, even if I understand why she felt like she had no other option. I think she could have tried harder to find a solution that didn't involve disappearing from their lives completely. But I also think she used the guilt from those choices to become a better person. The way she loved me was informed by the regret she felt about not loving them properly. She learned from her mistakes, even if that learning came too late to benefit her first family. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's very generous of you." "I don't know if it's generous or just necessary for my own sanity," I admitted. "I can't build a life on hating the person who gave me the foundation for everything good about myself. And Emma and Michael can't heal from their abandonment by staying angry at someone who's no longer here to make amends." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, preparing the garden beds for the growing season ahead. There was something therapeutic about tending to the plants Helena had chosen and nurtured, about continuing the work she'd started in creating this peaceful space. When we went back inside, we found Michael and Emma deep in conversation about the logistics of preserving and potentially publishing Helena's letters. They'd been researching similar projects, looking for examples of how other families had shared complicated stories of love and loss. "There's a publisher in Portland who specializes in family memoirs," Michael said as we joined them. "I called them this afternoon and they're interested in seeing a proposal." "That was fast," I said, settling into Helena's favorite armchair. "I think we're all ready to do something constructive with this story," Emma replied. "I'm tired of carrying it around like a burden. I want to transform it into something that might help other people." We spent the evening outlining what such a book might look like, how we could weave together Helena's letters with our own memories and reflections. It would be a complex narrative, one that didn't shy away from the pain Helena had caused, but also didn't minimize the love she'd learned to give. "I want people to understand that she wasn't a villain," Emma said as we worked. "She was a person who made a terrible choice for understandable reasons, and then spent the rest of her life trying to be worthy of the sacrifice she'd made. And I want people to understand that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to," I added. "Sometimes the most loving thing someone can do is the thing that looks selfish from the outside." As the evening wore on and Thomas woke up from his nap to help us plan the book, I realized that we'd found our way to something I'd never expected. Forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness that excused Helena's choices or minimized their impact, but the kind that acknowledged her humanity and chose to focus on growth rather than grievance. We'd created space for all our feelings about Helena: love and anger, gratitude and resentment, understanding and confusion. We'd learned that it was possible to grieve someone while also being furious with them, to be grateful for their love while also acknowledging the damage they'd caused. But most importantly, we'd learned that family could be something you chose to build deliberately, with intention and care, and a commitment to showing up for each other even when it was difficult. Helena had given us that lesson through her mistakes as much as through her successes. That night, as Emma, Michael, Sarah, and Thomas prepared to drive back to Bakersfield, we made plans for our next gathering. Emma would bring more of Helena's papers and photographs. Michael would research publishing options and legal requirements for sharing someone's private letters. I would continue going through Helena's house, looking for other pieces of her story that might add depth to our understanding of her choices. But we'd also made plans that had nothing to do with Helena's legacy. Sarah's birthday was coming up, and we wanted to celebrate together. Thomas was starting preschool in the fall, and we wanted to be present for that milestone. Emma was considering going back to school for her master's degree, and she wanted our input on programs and timing. We were building a life together that honored Helena's memory while also moving beyond the limitations her choices had imposed on all of us. We were becoming family in the truest sense, not because of blood or legal obligations, but because we'd chosen each other and committed to showing up for each other consistently. As I watched their car pull out of the driveway, I felt a peace that I'd never experienced before. Helena's house was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the echoes of laughter and conversation, with the promise of future visits, with the knowledge that I was no longer the only person who remembered the woman who'd lived here. I walked through the rooms one more time before bed, seeing them through new eyes. This wasn't just the house where Helena had built her second life anymore. It was the place where her biological children and her chosen daughter had learned to love each other. It was where her grandson had learned to make pancakes using her recipe. It was where we'd planned to share her story with the world in hopes of helping other families navigate similar challenges. Helena was gone, but the love she'd learned to give, complicated and imperfect as it had been, continued to create connections and heal wounds and build bridges between people who might otherwise have remained strangers. Her story wasn't finished yet. In many ways, we were just beginning to understand what it meant and how it could be used to create something beautiful from something broken. I fell asleep that night in Helena's room, surrounded by the gentle sounds of the house settling and the distant hum of traffic on the street outside. For the first time since I discovered her secret, I felt genuinely at peace with the complexity of our relationship. She'd been both the best mother I could have asked for and the worst mother Emma and Michael had experienced. Both things were true, and both things were part of the legacy she'd left behind. Tomorrow, I would continue the work of understanding her story and sharing it with the world. But tonight, I was simply grateful for the love she'd learned to give, however late and incomplete it had been. It was enough. It was everything. 2 years later, I stood in a bookstore in downtown Portland, holding a copy of Letters Never Sent, A Family's Journey Through Loss and Love, with trembling hands. The cover featured a photograph of Helena's handwriting, a page from one of her unsent letters to Emma, and seeing it displayed alongside dozens of other books felt surreal and overwhelming. The book had been released 3 weeks ago, and the response had been more powerful than any of us had expected. We'd received emails from parents struggling with depression, from children of divorce seeking understanding, from families torn apart by mental illness and addiction, and the thousand small wounds that can make love feel impossible to sustain. "Are you ready for this?" Emma asked, appearing beside me with Thomas in tow. He was 5 now, confident and chatty, wearing a button-down shirt for the occasion that made him look impossibly grown up. "I don't think anyone's ever ready to have their family's secrets displayed in a bookstore window," I replied, but I was smiling. "How are you feeling about it?" "Terrified and proud in equal measure," Emma admitted. "It still feels strange to see Mom's words out in the world like this, but the letters we've gotten from readers make it worth it." Michael joined us with Sarah, who was now his fiancée, and we all stood together looking at the display of our book. It felt like a milestone none of us could have imagined when we'd first met in Helena's living room 2.5 years ago. The bookstore had organized a reading and discussion event, and as people began to filter in, I recognized the mix of curiosity and pain on many of their faces. These were people who understood complicated family dynamics, who'd lived through their own versions of love and abandonment and the difficult work of forgiveness. "Thank you all for coming," I began when it was time to start. "This book exists because we discovered that the stories we tell ourselves about our families are often incomplete. Sometimes the people we love most are also the people who hurt us most deeply. And sometimes understanding why they made their choices doesn't make those choices hurt any less." Emma read from one of Helena's letters, her voice steady but emotional as she shared her mother's words about the weight of unfulfilled dreams. Michael talked about the experience of being left behind, about the particular pain of wondering if you'd done something wrong or if you simply hadn't been enough to make someone stay. But it was the questions from the audience that revealed the real impact of what we'd shared. A woman in her 50s talked about her own struggles with feeling trapped by motherhood, and how Helena's letters had helped her seek therapy instead of planning an escape. A man described reading the book with his adult children as they tried to understand why their mother had left when they were young. "What would you say to your aunt now if you could?" Someone asked me during the Q&A portion. I'd thought about this question countless times over the past 2 years. I think I'd tell her that her story didn't end when she died, I said. The love she learned to give, even if it came late and imperfectly, is still creating connections and healing wounds. I'd tell her that Emma and Michael and Thomas are part of my family now, not because of her blood, but because of her choices, both good and bad. And I'd tell her that we understand now why she felt like leaving was her only option, Emma added. But I'd also tell her that we found other ways to work through those same feelings, and that maybe she could have too if she'd been willing to try harder. After the event, we went to dinner at Helena's favorite restaurant in Salem, a small Italian place where she'd taken me for special occasions when I was younger. Thomas colored on the paper tablecloth while the adults talked about the unexpected directions our lives had taken since Helena's death. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah said as we waited for dessert. "About what Helena would think of all this. Do you think she'd be happy that her story is helping people?" "I think she'd be amazed that anything good came from the mess she left behind," Michael replied. "But I also think she'd be proud that we figured out how to love each other despite everything." "She always said that family was about showing up," I added. "And that's what we've done. We've shown up for each other, for her memory, and for the people who need to hear her story." As we drove back to Helena's house that evening, I thought about how much had changed since that first night when I discovered her photo albums. The house was still mine, but it felt less like a shrine to Helena's secret life, and more like a gathering place for the family we'd chosen to become. Emma and Michael visited regularly, sometimes bringing friends or partners, sometimes coming alone when they needed the peace of Helena's garden. Thomas had his own room now, decorated with pictures he'd drawn of the grandmother he'd never met but felt connected to through our stories and her recipes. I'd kept my job in Portland but had started working remotely most of the time, finding that I preferred the quiet rhythms of life in Salem to the bustle of the city. I'd begun dating someone, a fellow volunteer from the animal shelter where Helena had worked, and while it was still new, it felt like something that could grow into the kind of lasting love Helena had never quite managed to sustain. The success of the book had opened unexpected doors. We'd been invited to speak at conferences about family dynamics and mental health. A documentary filmmaker had reached out about adapting Helena's story for film. Therapists had begun recommending our book to clients struggling with similar issues. But the most meaningful response had come from Dr. Reeves, Helena's therapist in Bakersfield, who'd reached out after reading about the book in a professional journal. She'd asked to meet with us, and during a long conversation over coffee, she'd filled in some of the gaps in our understanding of Helena's mental state before she'd left. "Your mother was dealing with what we'd now recognize as a complex combination of depression, anxiety, and what some people call chronic restlessness," Dr. Reeves had explained. "She felt trapped not just by her circumstances but by her own inability to feel grateful for a life that looked perfect from the outside. Could therapy have helped her find a different solution?" Emma had asked. "Maybe," Dr. Reeves had replied honestly, "but she'd convinced herself that her unhappiness was damaging you children just by existing. She thought leaving was an act of love, even though it was also an act of desperation." That conversation had added another layer to our understanding of Helena's choices, but it hadn't fundamentally changed how we felt about them. She'd still caused tremendous pain through her decision to disappear, but she'd also used the freedom that choice had given her to become a better person, and that growth had benefited me and, eventually, had helped create the family connections we now cherished. As I prepared for bed in Helena's room, I looked at the framed photo on her nightstand that I'd discovered months after her death. It showed all of us, Helena in the center, surrounded by Emma, Michael, and me at various ages, with Thomas's ultrasound picture tucked into the corner. She'd created this composite image sometime before her death, combining photos from both her lives into a single family portrait that had never existed in reality. It was a picture of the family she'd dreamed of having but had never been brave enough to create while she was alive. But somehow, through the strange alchemy of love and loss and shared grief, we'd managed to build that family anyway. Helena's story had taught us that love could be both destructive and redemptive, that family could be both a burden and a gift, and that sometimes The most important connections in our lives came from the most unexpected places. She'd been wrong about many things, but she'd been right about the most important thing. Family was about showing up. And so we kept showing up, for each other, for her memory, and for all the people whose lives had been touched by her complicated legacy. Her story continued to unfold through our choices, through Thomas's laughter, through the readers who found hope in her letters, and through the love that grew stronger rather than weaker as we learned to carry her truth together. Some stories don't have neat endings, but they do have moments of grace. Helena's grace came through what we'd built from what she'd broken, through the family we'd chosen to become despite having every reason to remain strangers. She'd given us each other, even if she'd never intended to do so. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.